It is so huge that it took 30 years to build, straddling both the 19th and 20th centuries, costing the lives of up to 28,000 workers. 77 kilometres of waterway, but 77 kilometres that is crucially important, the Panama Canal. It connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by slicing through the narrowest strip of land in Central America. But the country of Panama only took control of it in 1999, 85 years after its inauguration. That because it was the US that built it, and the area around the canal became a real American colony, 1,400 square kilometres, nicknamed La Zona. At the height of its occupation in the 1950s, nearly 100,000 Americans lived there, isolated from the rest of the country. They'd created a little America, a campus with baseball and American football, shops with entirely imported products, homes built in the colonial style. A real wealth bubble from which local people were excluded. It wasn't until the late 90s that the area was gradually handed back to Panama.
I predict that Panama's administration of these facilities will be very successful. I want to remind the administrators about how hopeful Panama is about the future of these facilities and how important they are for the country's economic future.
At that point, most Americans chose to leave La Zona, but some stayed, and there remain some typically American traditions. Some bitter memories too, though, for some Panamanians. Well, Laurence, Cuvillier and Matthieu Comin revisit the children of the Panama Canal for France 24.
Batters, pitchers, announcements in English. At first glance, you could mistake this for baseball practice in Chicago or New York. But this is Panama. While in most of Latin America soccer reigns supreme, Panamanians swear by baseball.
We can be proud that the best reliever of all time was born in Panama, Mariano Rivera. One of the best batters, Rod Carew, was also born here.
In fact, these major league superstars weren't exactly born in Panama, but in the zone. A 16-kilometer-wide strip of land that bordered the canal and cut Panama in half for nearly a century, an American territory. This strange common border has deeply influenced Panamanian culture.
In a few years, Panama went from 5 to 50 leagues. Because playing against the gringos was great, it created a healthy competitive spirit between Americans and Panamanians.
The zone had all the markings of a quiet and prosperous southern United States village. John Mercier arrived there at the age of 17.
This was a small, artificial country led by engineers, designed by engineers.
The son of a soldier, he worked for the canal company all his life.
It was a paradise, a socialist paradise, which is interesting because most of the people who come from here are super conservatives and against socialism, and yet they grew up in a place where all the houses came from the government, the jobs came from the government, the health care was all provided. So we had so much money left over to do public works, to take care of the grass, to paint the houses, to change your light bulbs. Everything was done for the people.
John and his friend Enrique Sanchez were both Zonians, or inhabitants of the zone. But Enrique was born in a part of the zone that was reserved for Panamanian workers, often people of color. Segregation was still the rule.
It's important to know that this was an American part of the canal zone. And Panamanian kids who live near here, less than a mile away, say in Chorrillo, Santa Ana, and those areas, ellos siempre decían que cuando llegaban acá, los largaban. No podían jugar en el área.
The majority of these buildings are now occupied by Panamanians who live amid remains of the past.
The canal zone had its own dairies, made its own milk. It had made its own ice cream. All of that was here. This was the Balboa Theater, where we had movies that had been properly vetted by the canal had previewings to censor the movies.
It's in this house that John and his first wife raised their daughter.
Oh God, yeah, the mangoes here. Well, this mango tree is new.
After the canal was returned to Panama, John decided to stay in the country.
I had lived in several places before I came to Panama, and the day I stepped off the plane, I said, endless summer, beaches, very friendly young ladies with a natural tan. I said, this is where God wants this white boy to be.
But most of his compatriots have long since left.
The ones who grew up here watched the canal zone, their home, be destroyed, and that's what hurt them. They now miss Panama, but what they were in love with is gone.
As a child, Enrique and his 8 brothers and sisters lived another reality of the zone.
Pedro Miguel. Buenas, ¿cómo está, vecina?
Here we are in Pedro Miguel. It's a village that was part of the zone. But no Americans lived here, only Panamanians. In my time, it was mostly Panamanians who were descendants of the Afro-Caribbean workers who built the canal. I lived in this house from when I was 10 years old. It's a chalet. And since we were a big family, we had a big house with 4 bedrooms.
Enrique is the grandson of Jamaican workers who were brought here to dig the canal in appalling conditions. The work of clearing the inhospitable jungle left at least 24,000 dead. His father was an employee of the canal company during the time of the zone, and today, Enrique is a member of the canal's board of directors, a symbolic rise of a country that has freed itself from its foreign yoke.
As a boy, I never saw the Americans. No contact. Zero. Except the nurse. She was a very nice woman. She was the only white American woman I had contact with while growing up.
Despite this isolation, Enrique benefited from the excellent education provided in the zone. This allowed him to graduate from major universities in the United States and return as an engineer.
Politically, the principle, yeah, it sucked. It really was not, particularly looking back from our modern time. At the time, given the circumstances, it was pretty much the norm, but it lasted much longer than it should have.
Miroslava was born a few kilometers from the zone. Today, with her group Afrodisiaco, she sings about the diversity and the recovered sovereignty of her country, a richness and a pride after centuries of domination by the Spanish, then the French, then the Americans.
And that relationship that was first and foremost a racial and economic relationship was consolidated over several centuries. In the end, it has generational repercussions. It explains why the poorest, most deprived areas of the city are home to populations of Afro-Caribbean origin or indigenous people. This is really not a surprise.
In the small fishing ports along the canal, there are the container ships of opulence and the world of the disenfranchised. In 2016, Panama was ranked by the World Bank as the 6th worst country for economic inequality.
The container ships often tear off our nets as they pass by, and this is a problem for the owners of our boats. I've had several nets ripped off this way, and who is going to pay us back? Nobody. But the canal also has some good things. It brings us tourists, thank God. It helps us, tourists who want us to take them fishing.
The canal is not only the economic backbone of Panama, it also, according to Miroslava, traces a historical and social line.
For me, the ancestor of the canal is the African slave, because they were the ones who, at the very beginning, carried on their backs all the wealth that the Spaniards brought through Panama. These slaves crossed the isthmus on foot, building little by little the Great Way, transporting all the wealth stolen from America and going to Europe.
In his quiet residence overlooking the bay, John reopens for the first time the archives of his youth.
Photographs that my daughter put away. So let's find out what's in here.
John's passion was spending time in the jungle.
Certificate of training on basic tropic survival and ethnic familiarization course given by the Tropic Survival School.
He regularly took groups of young Americans on expeditions.
But it says, "Know all ye who witness the name inscribed below that the thereby mentioned tropical derelict who has braved the swamps and tiger-infested jungles of Camp Chagres Canal Zone, know ye that John P. Mercier is hereby appointed an alligator validator first class."
The canal itself was sometimes transformed into a huge playground.
The Cayuga race was a Boy Scout invention by Red Townsend and a few others, where the idea was to perpetuate the tradition and culture of making dugout canoes, the cayucos, and using them. Greatest dog in the world.
Today, this race is still held every year. But the good-natured atmosphere and the hand-carved cayucos made from a single tree trunk have given way to sophisticated fiberglass canoes, sponsors, and teams from around the world. As John grew older, he turned to the other advantages of living in the zone.
Okay, this is the Masonic Lodge that I was a member of when I first joined back in 1980. Masonry was the biggest social organization in the Canal Zone. Some people thought that if they joined the Masons, they could get somewhere. Since everybody was a Mason, it made no difference. It's hard to believe that we're all...
But the Zonians didn't just have fun adventures in the jungle.
Seem to have a fascination with me.
In fact, it was primarily a huge military base where daily training took place. Aristide lived outside the zone, but the space used by the US military extended far beyond. The people of this hometown all grew up with the sound of artillery.
We were completely used to the noise of the gunfire, the shooting, and the bombs.
The sound of the machine guns, we heard it during the school lessons and in the afternoon. It got louder. The warplanes would come. Our houses would shake as if it were an earthquake.
A friend of Aristide's suffered severe burns all over his body while playing with a shell found on a construction site as a child.
The explosion was so strong that the Americans came to help. They hurried him to the hospital. That stayed with me for life.
It's estimated that 33,000 hectares of Panama may be contaminated by explosives. Some areas were also used as testing grounds for chemical weapons.
They claim they have cleaned up after themselves, but it's not true. You see those bombs? They're still there.
In these forests near villages, many people hunt and fish. It was while he was going to bathe in a river that Aristide also had an accident.
Suddenly, I felt a wire stretched on my belly, and that held me. And I heard this hissing. Then an explosion, then nothing more. I plugged and unplugged my ears, but I couldn't hear anything, not even my friends' voices.
Aristide later had to undergo eardrum surgery. Today, he still forbids his grandchildren to go walking in the forest. Shells, mortars, bombs, just going for a simple walk, you can find several still intact. But the lack of information on the subject makes it harder to manage the danger.
I've talked to several people about this, but I realize that they don't believe me. For them, it's not possible. The Americans must have cleaned up. They are the best in the world. And they don't give up. No, the Americans don't make these kind of mistakes in their military practices.
Hay agua del canal da vida, hay agua del canal da vida, al tambor la...
Today, Miroslava lives in Clayton, a village in the former zone. A quiet form of revenge. She could only have accessed this area with a special permit as a child.
legado de mil razas, del tambor de la alegría. Agua del canal, hay agua dulce y agua clara.
The American 20th century that was imposed on Panamanians has left contrasting memories.
You know, Bob Dylan is American, and Chuck Berry, the blues. So to me, the Americans were not necessarily bad neighbors. Politically, of course, they made a lot of mistakes, but culturally, I believe they nurtured us a lot.
Quiero sembrar un maíz en la zona del canal y sobre el verde arroza la saloma más feliz.
Finally masters of their destiny, Panamanians now have other challenges to face: inequality, corruption, financial crime. This bridge spans the canal but also crosses between North and South America. A link between two continents, like a stitch to help heal the wounds of the past.
Laurence, Cuvillier and Matthieu Comin revisiting the children of the Panama Canal for France 24. Well, that's all from this week's edition. Don't forget, of course, you can catch it and the previous editions as well on our website at france24.com. Thanks very much for watching. More news coming up for you shortly.